New York State prisons are making changes to what many experts say is cruel and unusual punishment. We're talking here about solitary confinement. In some cases, that means 23 hours a day in isolation.
News 4's Jen Shahn spoke to a local expert and has the details on this decision and the psychological impacts it could have. Jen?
Well, Don, right now there are almost 4,000 inmates in New York in solitary confinement essentially all day. A social psychologist tells me the short and long-term effects of eliminating a human need she says is as basic as food and water is catastrophic. Now, about 2 years ago, the state made some changes to solitary. Now even bigger ones are in store.
There's just no doubt that this constitutes cruel and unusual punishment. I mean, there just isn't.
The state eliminated the use of solitary confinement or special housing for pregnant women, most developmentally disabled inmates, and inmates under 18 about 2 years ago. It was part one of a settlement for a lawsuit brought on by the New York Civil Liberties Union.
Too often, extreme isolation or solitary confinement is used as a tool of first resort in minor, mostly nonviolent disciplinary offenses.
Last December, the NYCLU reached a major milestone agreement on part two of the settlement. A federal judge approved a class action lawsuit. It would reduce the number of inmates in solitary by around 25%. It would also cut down on the duration and frequency of isolation.
Our prison system is extremely large. And what we did through this process is deconstruct the process for solitary confinement.
Prior to the lawsuit, which began about 4.5 years ago, the NYCLU conducted a one-year study at several of the state's facilities. How long were some of these inmates kept in administrative segregation or solitary?
I think the first one that comes to mind is one man that was kept for more than 1,100 days and released directly to his community for what they said was falsifying a legal document.
In prison studies that they've done, they've found that it takes less than 15 days for people to suffer irreversible psychological damage. So we're not just talking about it being upsetting, which happens right away, but irreversible damage.
UB Associate Professor Shira Gabriel studies humans' need to interact and the damaging effects of ignoring that need.
We need social contact. We're a social species, so when you don't have it, your brain is being given the message that something is very wrong in your environment that needs to be changed.
Right away, Professor Gabriel says isolation can cause anxiety, which can quickly lead to depression. If isolation continues, a person will experience mental confusion, eventually anger, and even hallucinations. Western Regional Director of the NYCLU, John Kerr III, says one of the major problems with solitary is how often inmates are released directly to the public afterwards. Currently in New York State, there are just under 4,000 inmates in solitary confinement. More than 500 of them are here in Western New York.
What we discovered is the vast majority of these cells that have been constructed in some, these 5,000 cells that have been constructed at some 39 facilities are largely the size of a parking place.
According to the terms of this new settlement, affected inmates must be moved within 3 years.
We looked at other states. We worked with 2 experts in coming up with many of these changes. And we think it does provide a roadmap for many other states that may be looking at their systems to look to see how they can modernize the use of solitary confinement without compromising safety.
Kerr is optimistic and says this settlement is a historic step forward. Here's what's going to change. The maximum amount of time an inmate will spend in isolation will be 3 months for all first-time nonviolent infractions. Solitary won't be used for first-time drug violations. The number of infractions where isolation is used as punishment will be cut in half. And for the first time, inmates will be able to make phone calls while in solitary. The Department of Corrections also has plans to provide offline tablets to inmates, but there's only 30 available for the entire state. Professor Gabriel thinks solitary should be tossed out completely, but says in general studies, the slightest bit of social stimulation can improve someone's mental health while in isolation.
Those things are very helpful as social surrogates. So if you can give people books to read, if you can let them watch television, if you can give them a way to communicate through email or through social media with other people, even in a very controlled way, that can go a long way.
Now, I should mention solitary confinement is not just a New York State issue. Recently, President Obama put changes in place this year that would ban the use of solitary for minors nationally. This was after the Department of Justice found that this cuts down on their ability to be rehabilitated upon their release.
And we should mention as well that we've heard from some corrections officers who say this punishment is reserved for the toughest cases they have, and they need it.
Well, I would have been very eager to speak with someone from the Department of Corrections on this story. Unfortunately, they were not willing to go on camera and talk to us. As you heard from the NYCLU, according to their study, they did a one-year study at several state facilities. They found that solitary confinement was used for offenses that were not necessarily violent, like falsifying a legal document or even smoking. So that was part of their concern. But we have got a lot of feedback, some of which you mentioned is from people who worked in the Department of Corrections. And we want to hear from you, so you can join this conversation. You can follow it online at WIVB.com and on Facebook and Twitter. Just click on News 4 Buffalo.
Thank you, Jen.